Name the pattern on this tea set and take it. You're stalling.
I'm looking. Lansdowne Rose, discontinued in 1938. Hand-painted, not transferware. Maybe 400 full sets ever made.
Lucky guess.
A pattern can be copied. A mend cannot. I learned to read this kind of work before I learned to drive a truck. That is not a guess. That is a fact with a name.
Careful. Confidence like that gets expensive.
So does being wrong about what a thing is worth.
Somebody in that room had spent years telling a widow that the finest pieces she owned were the least worth keeping, just carefully enough that she believed it every time. And once I named the one piece she had never let go of, that somebody understood exactly how much I could take away from her, and how fast she needed to move. I did not know it yet. But that name was about to become the most expensive thing I had ever said out loud. My name is Rhett Monroe. I am 41 years old, and I drive a truck for Renwick Auction House out of a warehouse on the edge of Fenimore Creek. Most days that means wrapping furniture and moving blankets, hauling boxes down narrow staircases, and standing very still while somebody's grandmother decides whether a lamp is worth keeping. It is not a job that impresses anyone at a barbecue. It pays the bills, and it puts me inside more houses full of family history than almost any other job in town. The warehouse smells like packing blankets and cedar shavings, and the trucks are old enough that the radio only picks up 2 stations reliably. And most of the men I work with think that is the whole of what I know about the things we haul. What most people who hire us never learn is that I spent 4 years, starting at 16, sweeping the floor of a China restoration shop 3 streets over, owned by a man named Percy Hadley. Percy had been mending broken porcelain since before I was born, gluing hairline cracks with patience most people reserve for their own children, filling losses with tinted resin so fine you needed raking light to find them, and for the pieces that deserved it. Finishing a repair the old way, in thin gold lacquer. So the mend became part of the object instead of a wound hidden from view. He taught me to read a piece of porcelain the way a jeweler reads a stone, patiently, distrustfully, refusing to believe anything until the object itself proved it, the weight of it, the way light passed through a good rim and stopped dead at a bad one, the mark stamped or painted on the underside, and what that mark actually proved once you knew where to look for the ones that had been faked. He kept an ultraviolet lamp on his workbench for exactly that reason. Old glazes and new glazes are made from different things, and under the right light they answer that question honestly, even when the maker's mark on the bottom lies. I remember the first time he let me hold a piece worth more than my father's car. It was a plate. Nothing dramatic to look at, and he set it in my hands and told me to be more afraid of my own carelessness than of the plate itself, because the plate had already survived 100 years of people who were careless with it. And it would survive me too if I paid attention. I dropped nothing that year or the year after, and by the time I turned 20, I could pick up almost any piece of porcelain in that shop and tell him, within a decade, when it had been made and whether the story the seller told about it was true. I never opened my own restoration shop, not because I did not want to, but because the year I turned 23, I married Jo. And a trade that took decades to build a client list wide enough to feed 2 people was not something either of us was willing to wait decades for. Percy understood it better than I expected him to. He told me there was no shame in choosing the truck instead, so long as I kept my eyes sharp, even while my hands were busy with something else. Callan took 9 more years to arrive, long enough that we had quietly stopped expecting him, which only made him twice the gift once he finally did. I have thought about that conversation with Percy more times than I can count, usually while I am hauling somebody's dresser down a narrow staircase, wondering whether the eyes stayed sharp or just got lonely. Percy died 4 years ago on a cold morning in February and left me that lamp along with 1 cup. Not a valuable one, a plain cream-colored teacup with a rose pattern he had bought for himself decades earlier at an estate sale, cracked clean through the handle, and mended it in gold lacquer as a demonstration piece, the kind he used to show new customers what patience could do to something broken. He never sold it. He kept it on his own shelf until the day he died, and told me once, drying his hands after a long afternoon of gluing. A pattern can be copied. A mend cannot. Anyone with a kiln and enough patience could fake a pattern, he said. But a mend proved somebody had already cared enough to fix the thing once, and nobody fakes that kind of proof for fun. My son Callan is 8, and he has a way of talking about himself that took me a while to actually appreciate. He narrates himself out loud, in the third person, like a nature documentary about a very small, very serious boy. Callan approaches the cereal with caution. Callan considers his options. His mother used to do the voice back at him, low and solemn, until he laughed so hard milk came out his nose. Joe passed on an ordinary Wednesday morning 3 years back, an aneurysm nobody had any warning of, gone before the ambulance even finished pulling into the driveway. Some mornings I still expect to hear her doing that voice from the next room, narrating my own bad coffee back at me the way she used to, and some mornings the quiet where that voice should be sits heavier on me than anything Callan says all day. Callan does not remember much of her narrating with him, though he insists he does, and I have stopped correcting him, because a boy is allowed to keep whatever version of his mother helps him get through a Tuesday. I kept her recipe box on the kitchen counter for a year after she died, before I could bring myself to open it, and when I finally did, I found she had written little notes in the margins of half the cards. Not instructions, just thoughts. The way some people talk to themselves while they cook. Callan does not know that box exists yet. I am saving it for whenever he is old enough to want to hear his mother's handwriting instead of just my memory of her voice. Constance Vale called Renwick Auction House on a Tuesday in early October, asking for help cataloging and moving the last of her belongings before a permanent move into a smaller retirement cottage across town. The lease already signed for November 1st, 5 weeks out. She was 74, sharp in the way some people stay sharp their whole lives, small and precise in her movements. And she met us at the door of a house that had clearly once held a much bigger collection than the one still sitting inside it. The living room walls carried the pale, rectangular ghosts of paintings that used to hang there. The dining room cabinets, when she opened them, held less than half of what the shelf space seemed built to hold, everything arranged with the careful, deliberate spacing of someone trying not to notice how much room had been left empty. "There used to be more," she said, walking us through a dining room with 2 glass front cabinets, most of the shelves noticeably thin. "I have been letting things go for years now. My friend Rosalyn has been such a help with all of it. Most of what I had was just ordinary anyway. Depression-era stuff, she tells me. Pretty, but common as dirt." Rosalyn Winslow arrived 20 minutes later, in a green coat, carrying a clipboard, and the easy confidence of someone who had been welcome in that house for a very long time. She was 52, tall, with the kind of unhurried voice that made people lean in to listen, rather than raise their own to be heard. She ran an estate consulting service out of a shop front called Harrow Lane Consignment, and Constance introduced her as the woman who had made downsizing bearable, who understood which pieces mattered and which were only taking up space. "Rosalyn has been a godsend," Constance said, patting the other woman's arm. "I would have drowned in all of this years ago without her. She has such an eye. Better than any appraiser I ever paid for, and she never once charged me for the advice." "That's what friends are for?" Rosalyn said, smiling at Constance in a way that looked, from where I stood, entirely genuine. The house itself told its own kind of story. If you knew how to read it, the way I had learned to read porcelain. Sun-faded rectangles on the wallpaper where paintings had hung for decades before they didn't. A side table with 4 matching lamp bases, and only 1 lamp left standing on it. Constance walked us through each room slowly, narrating what used to sit were the way some people narrate old photographs, equal parts pride and grief. And Rosalyn trailed a half step behind her the entire time, nodding at exactly the right moments, touching Constance's elbow at exactly the right moments. The practiced choreography of someone who had performed this particular kindness enough times to make it look effortless. It was Rosalyn who pulled the last teapot and its 4 matching cups out of a padded box on the dining table, set it down hard enough to rattle the lid, and asked me, in front of Constance and both of my coworkers, to name the pattern and take it if I could. I answered her honestly, because I did not yet know what that honesty was going to set in motion. My coworker Milt, who had been loading boxes with me all morning and had never once asked what I did for this job, looked at me like I had pulled a rabbit out of a moving blanket. Rosalyn's expression did not change, but she wrote something down on her clipboard before she moved on to the next room, and I remember thinking, at the time, that it was probably nothing. I understood only later that the dare had never really been meant for me. It was meant for Constance. One more stranger shrugging at her treasure would have been one more quiet proof that the whole set really was as ordinary as Rosalyn kept telling her, and the teapot sitting between us was the last piece Constance had never let go of. I was only ever supposed to fail politely, in front of the one audience whose opinion actually mattered. Callan came along with me for a half day of school that Friday, sitting in the truck's cab with his own clipboard, narrating deliveries to himself while I worked. He liked Constance immediately, the way children like adults who ask real questions instead of the easy ones, and she liked him back enough to bring out a plate of shortbread every time we came by. "That is a very fine tea service," Constance told me, the second time I came to catalog what remained of the dining room cabinets, while Callan sat at the far end of the table narrating his own shortbread consumption under his breath. "My husband Edmund bought it for our 10th anniversary. We were not wealthy people that year, not by a long way. And he never told me how much it cost until decades later, half joking, half proud of himself. He always said it would be worth something someday, and I always told him I would rather drink my tea out of it than sell it someday or not." She smiled at the memory, small and private. "Rosalyn tells me it is a lovely reproduction, honestly, nothing more, but I have never been able to make myself part with it." Reproduction of what pattern? Lansdowne Rose, I believe she called it. Common enough in its day, apparently. I did not correct her that afternoon. I finished the inventory sheet, loaded 2 boxes of linens into the truck, and drove home, turning the word common over and over, because nothing about the piece I had held 2 days earlier looked common to me. The weight was wrong for a reproduction, too light and too even. The glaze pooled at the foot ring the way only a hand-dipped piece pools, never quite the same twice. And the rose itself was hand-painted, each petal carrying the small, honest variation of a brush loaded slightly differently than the last, exactly the kind of thing Percy had spent 4 years teaching me to see. That night, after Callan was asleep, I took Percy's lamp down from the closet shelf where it had sat since his funeral, wiped a season of dust off the housing, and drove back out to Constance's house the next morning before the crew's official start time, with her permission and a story about double-checking measurements for the moving truck. Constance let me into the dining room and stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the morning chill, while I switched off the overhead light and plugged in the lamp. The bulb needed a moment to warm, the way it always had in Percy's shop, a low violet hum before the light steadied. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Old glazes and new glazes are made from different minerals," I said, angling the light low across the teapot's surface. "Under this kind of light, they answer that back, whether anyone wants them to or not." The glaze on the teapot fluoresced a soft, honeyed color along every brushstroke the moment the light passed over it, the signature of an older mineral formula, uneven in exactly the way a hand-mixed batch from decades ago would be uneven. A modern reproduction glaze, loaded with different oxides for cost and consistency, would have thrown back a colder, flatter white, the same shade end to end. This threw back gold. This was not a reproduction. This was the real thing. Exactly what Rosalyn had spent months telling a woman it was not. Constance did not say anything for a long moment, watching the light move across a piece she had owned for 40 years, without ever once seeing it like this. "It looks like it is glowing," she said finally. "It's telling the truth." Most things do, if you know how to ask. I found the mini twist waiting for me in Constance's own hallway on my way back out. In a row of framed photographs I must have walked past a dozen times without really looking at them. A picture from what looked like the early 1990s, Constance younger, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame, Edmund beside her in a cardigan, and behind them both, on the very cabinet I had just finished cataloging, a full matching set of the same rose-patterned teapot, sugar bowl, creamer, and 8 cups arranged in 2 neat rows, twice what remained now. I stood in that hallway longer than I should have, doing the math on my fingers like a child, counting cups in a 30-year-old photograph against the 2 sitting in a padded box in my truck. "Where did the rest of it go?" I asked her, standing in the hallway with the photograph still in my hands. "Donated, most of it," Constance said, and something in her voice slowed down as she said it. The way people talk when they are hearing their own words differently than they meant to. Rosalind arranges it. A shelter downtown takes housewares, she tells me, and it always felt good to give something useful away instead of just selling it for pennies at an estate sale. Edmund would have hated the idea of any of it sitting in a stranger's cabinet with a price tag on it. Giving it away felt kinder. Do you have any paperwork from the donations? A receipt? Anything with a description of what went? I never thought to ask for one. Constance set the photograph frame down on the hall table, carefully, both hands. She handles all of that. It always seemed rude to check up on a friend. I have known Rosalyn for 10 years, Rhett. She held my hand at Edmund's funeral. I did not think I needed a receipt for someone who did that. She did not cry in front of me that day, though I suspected driving away that she did once I had gone. I did not say anything else that day, but I understood standing in that hallway that 6 matching cups, a sugar bowl, and a creamer had left that house over the last several years. Under the word donated, and not one piece of paper existed anywhere to say where they had actually gone. I could not shake the number the whole drive home. 8 cups down to 2. A full service reduced, piece by piece, to the one item Constance had refused to let go of, the one Rosalyn had just tried to talk a stranger out of in front of witnesses. If Rosalyn genuinely believed the pattern was common, there was no reason to fight that hard over 4 remaining cups and a teapot. Somebody does not challenge a mover to name a pattern worth nothing. Percy had kept meticulous records his whole career, out of habit more than necessity, and I remembered him mentioning once, years ago over coffee, that any insurance appraisal he wrote for a client eventually became part of that client's estate paperwork if they ever passed and the estate went through probate. Edmund Vale had died in 2010. If Percy had ever appraised this collection for insurance, and if that appraisal had made it into Edmund's probate filing, there would be a record sitting in the county courthouse right now, dated decades before Rosalyn Winslow ever set foot in that dining room, with the true pattern name written on it in black and white. I called the county probate clerk's office the following Monday, standing in the warehouse parking lot on my break with the phone pressed to one ear and a finger in the other, and gave Edmund Vale's name and the year of his death. The clerk on the line sounded bored in the specific way of someone who fields odd requests every day of her working life and told me politely and without any drama at all that estate inventories filed with probate cases become public record once the case closes, and that I was welcome to request a copy for a small processing fee payable by mail or in person. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the house, thin enough that I almost did not open it, standing at the mailbox. Inside was a photocopy of a 14-year-old insurance appraisal, the paper gone soft and gray at the folds, Percy Hadley's own signature at the bottom in the same blocky handwriting I used to see on shop receipts. One hand-painted porcelain tea service, the appraisal read, Lansdowne Rose Pattern, discontinued 1938, 8 cups, teapot, sugar bowl, creamer, condition excellent, provenance confirmed through manufacturer records. The insured value was listed beside it, a figure that made my stomach drop when I converted it in my head to what 4 surviving pieces alone would be worth today, adjusted for 14 years and a pattern that had only gotten rarer since. I read it twice at the kitchen table before Callan came downstairs, and a third time after he left for school, the way you reread something true because some part of you is still waiting for it to change. That was the first link, sitting quietly in a courthouse basement the entire time, filed under a dead man's name, completely outside anything Rosalyn Winslow could reach or explain away. The following week, I made the kind of mistake that takes far longer to fix than it took to make. I drove to Harrow Lane Consignment on my lunch break, walked in past a window full of mismatched china and old lamps, and told Rosalind, plainly, standing at her own counter, that I had found the original appraisal and knew exactly what the Lansdowne Rose pattern was actually worth. She did not even look up from the ledger in front of her right away. When she finally did, her expression had not changed at all. The same easy pleasantness she had worn in Constance's dining room. "That's quite a project you've taken on," she said. "Insurance appraisals from 30 years ago rarely reflect current market conditions, you understand. Patterns fall in and out of fashion. A number on an old piece of paper does not mean what you think it means. It means somebody who actually knew porcelain looked at that set and called it rare. You told Constance it was common. She did not deny anything after that. She simply thanked me for stopping by, told me she always appreciated a young man who took his work seriously, and asked, almost gently, whether Renwick Auction House knew I was conducting personal research on a client's property during work hours. "I'm asking because I care about her," I said, "not because of my job." "How touching." She set her pen down, folding her hands atop the ledger, and looked at me the way you look at a puzzle you have already solved. "Let me explain something to you, since you seem new to this part of the business. Old women get confused about what things are worth. It happens gradually, and it happens to nearly all of them. And the kindest thing anyone can do is help manage that confusion before it costs them more than a teacup. I have been managing Constance's confusion for 10 years. You have known her for 6 weeks. She is not confused about anything. You have been telling her a lie so many times, it started sounding like the truth to you too. "Careful," she said. The same word she had used in that dining room, and something in the way she said it made the shop feel smaller than it had a moment earlier. "You work for a company that profits when estates sell for more. I would think about how that looks before you decide who the dishonest one is here." I understood only after I left that I had just given her something more useful than any answer she could have offered me back. I had given her a reason to move fast. 2 days later, my manager called me into the office at the warehouse, a call I should have expected and somehow had not. Someone had phoned Renwick Auction House directly, declining to give a name, to report that one of the movers was harassing an elderly client and her financial advisor, conducting personal investigations on company time. My manager was not unkind about it, but he was clear. One more complaint like that, he said, and he would have no choice but to pull me off the estate routes entirely, which were most of the routes that paid overtime. Milt spoke up before I could say a word in my own defense, standing in the doorway with a moving blanket still over one shoulder. He told my manager he had personally watched me name a discontinued porcelain pattern in under 10 seconds flat, cold, off the top of my head, and that whatever else this was, it was not a man inventing trouble to fill his afternoons. My manager did not take back the warning. He did at least decide to believe me. That same week, my phone rang while I was loading a dresser onto the truck, and Constance's voice on the other end told me everything I needed to know before she even finished her first sentence. "I gave her the sugar bowl and the creamer," Constance said. "Rosalyn came by this morning, so concerned, said there had been some confusion caused by a well-meaning but overstepping delivery man, and that it would be simplest for everyone if those 2 pieces went to the shelter right away, before any more misunderstandings complicated things." She made it sound like she was protecting me from something. "Constance, there is no confusion. There is a woman who has been lying to you for years." "I know that now." She went quiet for a long moment, and that quiet told me more than any sentence would have. "I trusted her, Rhett. I have trusted her for a decade. It did not occur to me to say no." 2 more pieces gone, under the same word as everything before them, moved faster because of exactly the question I had asked out loud 2 days earlier. I decided, sitting in my truck outside Constance's house that afternoon, that I would not make that mistake a second time. Stopping this meant getting proof solid enough that no amount of clipboard confidence could argue it away, and I needed it before the teapot and the 2 remaining cups disappeared the same way everything else had. The second piece of that proof came from a woman named Yolanda Pierce, who had worked the counter at Harrow Lane Consignment for 3 years before quitting 6 months earlier. I found her through the shelter Constance had mentioned, a modest thrift operation 2 towns over that. When I finally called and asked, told me they had no record of ever receiving a donation from Rosalyn Winslow or Harrow Lane Consignment, not once. In the 11 years, the shelter had been keeping donor logs. Yolanda agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the highway, a place with a laminated menu and a bell over the door that never quite stopped ringing, and she was already there when I pulled in, sitting stiffly in the far booth, her eyes flicking toward the door every time it opened. "I almost did not come," she said, wrapping both hands around a paper cup she had not touched. "I told myself for 6 months that quitting was enough, that I did not owe anybody an explanation for why. You don't owe me one either. I know. I am giving it to you anyway." She finally took a sip of her coffee, grimaced at the temperature, and set it back down. "I quit Because I got tired of writing intake tags for things that never went where the client thought they went, she told me, turning the cup slowly between her hands. Rosalyn kept a private client book, separate from the shop's regular consignment ledger. I only saw inside it once, by accident, filing something on her desk while she was on the phone. What was in it? Names. Private buyers, collectors mostly. People who paid cash or wire transfer for specific pieces she never listed in the shop window. There was an entry for a piece described exactly the way you just described that tea set. Lansdowne Rose, 1 cup, sold for a number with 3 commas in it. She paused. I remember it because I had personally logged that same cup into the shop 3 weeks earlier as a donation intake. No charge to the client. Headed for a shelter that, as far as I could tell, never got it. Did you ever see who bought it? A name and a phone number, and something better than either one. She slid a folded receipt across to the table. A private buyer's confirmation, dated, itemized, listing 1 Lansdowne Rose cup at full collector value, purchased directly from Rosalyn Winslow personally, not from the shop. A photocopy I made my last week there, of the shop's own file copy. A name on a napkin felt like something nobody would ever believe. Paper like this felt like something nobody could argue with. Are you going to be all right? I asked, folding the receipt into my jacket pocket. If this goes where I think it's going, your name might come up. Yolanda shrugged, though her hands were not steady doing it. I have thought about that every day for 6 months. I decided I would rather be the woman who said something than the woman who kept quiet because it was easier. She finally smiled, small and tired. Besides, somebody has to tell that old woman the truth eventually. Might as well be somebody who actually liked working there once, before I didn't anymore. That was the second link and most of the third, sitting in my hand in a coffee shop 2 towns over. A dated sale, under Rosalyn's own name, proving beyond any donation story that she had known exactly what the pattern was, and exactly what it was worth the entire time she was telling Constance otherwise. I still needed one thing to tie it all together cleanly. The probate filing proved what the pattern truly was. Yolanda's receipt proved Rosalyn had sold a matching piece at full value under her own name. What I needed now was proof that the timing lined up, that Rosalind alone had physical access to Constance's cabinets during the exact weeks each piece disappeared. That answer came, unexpectedly, from Callan. We were at the community park the following Saturday, Callan narrating his progress across the monkey bars to an audience of nobody, when a woman in a green coat sat down on a nearby bench and struck up a friendly conversation with him while I was 15 feet away tying my shoe. I looked up in time to see him nod politely at whatever she was saying, the way we had taught him to be polite to grown-ups. And by the time I crossed the grass to reach them, Rosalyn Winslow was already standing, smiling, telling me what a delightful boy I had, and that she had recognized him from a photograph on Constance's refrigerator. He has your look about him, she said. I told him Mrs. Kellerman must be very proud. A boy who talks in such complete sentences. I had never mentioned Callan's teacher to Rosalind, not once, in any conversation we had ever had. How do you know his teacher's name? Rosalind's smile held. The same practiced calm she had worn the day she set that clipboard down hard enough to rattle a teapot lid. Small town, she said, and walked off toward the parking lot without hurrying, the way people leave when they have already decided the conversation is over. I stood there a moment longer than I meant to, watching her cross the parking lot without once looking back, and understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, that she had wanted me to notice exactly what she knew. It was not a threat spoken out loud. It did not need to be. She had simply proven, in under a minute, that my son's world was not as separate from this fight as I had let myself believe. She knew my teacher's name, Callan told me in the truck afterward, in his narrator voice, flat and observational, in a way that made my hands go cold on the wheel. Callan wonders how the tea lady knew that. Callan did not tell her. Constance called that night before I had decided what to do with any of it. She asked me about him once, months ago, over tea, she said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. I told her his teacher's name because I was proud of him, Rhett. I have told that woman everything for 10 years. I never once thought about what she might do with any of it. Even your boy. I did not call the police that day, because nothing had happened that a court would recognize as a threat. Only a woman who had learned, somewhere, small private details about my son that she had no honest reason to know. What I did instead was drive straight to the county Consumer Protection Division and ask for the fraud unit, where an investigator named Dara Osei sat me down in a small office that smelled like old coffee, took notes in a cramped, efficient hand, and did not offer me a single reassuring word until I had finished every sentence I had come there to say. "Walk me through it again from the beginning," she said once I finished, pen already moving across a legal pad. "Slower this time. I want the dates." I went through all of it a second time. The probate filing, Yolanda's receipt, the park, Callan's small, flat voice repeating a teacher's name he had never told anyone but us. Dara listened the whole way through without her expression changing, the particular stillness of someone who had heard variations of this story more times than she wanted to count. "Nothing you just told me surprises me," she said when I finished. "That is not the same as being able to act on it yet, and I would rather you hear that plainly now than assume we are further along than we actually are." She tapped the pad with her pen. "A probate filing proves the pattern's identity. A private sale receipt proves Rosalyn knew that identity and profited from it. Neither one by itself proves she was the only person who could have taken the missing pieces out of that house during the windows they went missing. I need something connecting her physical access to the timing, something a defense attorney cannot wave away as coincidence. So none of what I already have matters. It matters plenty. It just is not enough yet to force a business license review on its own. Find me the access piece and I can move within a week." "How long do these things usually take?" I asked. "Once you actually open a case. Depends on how fast the paperwork comes back and how hard the other side fights it." Dara set her pen down and looked at me directly for the first time since I had sat down. "I will tell you something I probably should not. I have seen a dozen versions of this exact story in 11 years on this job. Somebody trusted, somebody elderly, somebody who does not ask for receipts because asking feels like an accusation. The ones that actually stick are the ones where somebody outside the family found the paper trail before the family gave up looking. You already did the hardest part. Now I need the part that survives a defense attorney standing in front of a judge, asking hard questions about opportunity. And if I can't find that part, then it stays a very convincing story that nobody with the authority to act on it can prove in a courtroom. I am not telling you that to discourage you. I am telling you because I would rather you hear it from me now than from a judge later." Driving home, I kept turning over something Percy used to say about mending broken things, a lesson I had always assumed stopped at the edge of a workbench. A mend belongs to whoever actually did the work, he meant, whether that work was fixing a crack or fixing the story built around one. Watching a woman rebuild her own reputation out of somebody else's carefully managed absence, I understood for the first time that he might have meant it as a rule about people, too. The timing proof, when it finally arrived, was sitting in the last place I thought to look, in a kitchen drawer I had walked past a dozen times. Constance mentioned it almost in passing while she was showing me where to pack the last of her linens. She had kept a wall calendar every year for as long as she could remember, the free kind the pharmacy gave away each December, and she never once threw the old ones out because Edmund used to tease her about it, and some habits outlive the person who started them. 10 years of calendars, stacked flat in a kitchen drawer, and on nearly every one of them in pencil. In her own careful hand, she had written the same 2 words on the mornings Rosalyn came by, tea with Rosalind. I sat at her kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon, laying the calendars out year by year, matching pencil marks against the dates Constance remembered pieces going missing, the donation dates, the quiet weeks that followed each one. Every single date lined up. 10 years of a friendship, recorded faithfully in a widow's own handwriting, had become the only map anyone needed of exactly when Rosalyn Winslow had been standing inside that house. "I never once missed writing it down," Constance said, watching me work, her voice caught somewhere between pride and horror. "I wanted to remember every visit. I had no idea I was keeping evidence." That closed the third link. Not a confession, just a decade of a woman's own careful memory, useless to anyone who did not already know exactly which drawer to open. I gave everything to Dara Osei on a Wednesday. By Friday, Rosalyn had convinced Constance to sign nothing new, because there was nothing left to sign. Instead, she called Constance directly, told her that a jealous former employee and an overreaching delivery man were spreading dangerous, unfounded accusations, and suggested gently that the final teapot and its 2 cups be moved to a secure storage unit immediately for safekeeping until the confusion passed. Constance, to her enormous credit, did not agree. I called Rosalyn back after I hung up with her, Constance told me that evening, her voice steadier than I had heard it in weeks. I told her I wanted to see, with my own eyes, every donation receipt from the last 3 years before a single cup left this house again. She got very quiet. That quiet told me more than anything you or that investigator could have said. The confrontation happened 4 days later in Constance's dining room at Constance's own request. She invited Rosalyn to come discuss the collection one final time, framing it as a chance to settle any lingering confusion, and asked me and Dara Osei to be present as well. Constance set out tea for everyone beforehand, in ordinary, everyday cups, none of it the Lansdowne Rose, and told me quietly in the kitchen that she wanted Rosalyn sitting in a chair at a table, like a guest, right up until the moment that stopped being true. Rosalyn arrived composed, clipboard in hand, wearing the same easy confidence she had worn the very first day I met her, and opened by suggesting that the entire situation had been manufactured by a man with something to gain, pointing out, not unreasonably to anyone who did not already know better, that I worked for the auction house, standing to profit from whatever the collection eventually sold for. I understand this looks concerning, she said, addressing Constance directly, her voice as gentle as it had always been. But you have known me for 10 years. You have known him for 6 weeks. I would think very carefully about whose judgment you trust with something this important. That is an interesting theory, Dara Osei said. It does not explain a probate filing from 2010 describing this pattern by name, 14 years before Mr. Monroe ever set foot in this house. It does not explain a private sale receipt with your signature on it, for a piece you told Mrs. Vale was worthless. And it does not explain 10 years of Mrs. Vale's own kitchen calendars, written in her own hand, placing you at this address on the exact dates 4 pieces disappeared. For a moment, Rosalyn said nothing at all, her eyes moving between Dara and the clipboard in her own lap, as though the answer might be written somewhere on it. An old woman's calendar proves nothing on its own, she said finally. People write things down and forget why. Neither does a private sale, if that receipt is even genuine, which I have no way to confirm sitting in this room. Then explain the receipt, Constance said, and the whole room went quiet in a way I felt in my chest. She had not raised her voice at all, and somehow that made it worse for Rosalyn than shouting would have. Explain why you told me to my face, more than once, that the pattern I have owned since 1985 was common, while you were selling a single cup of it for more than most people make in a year. I do not need Rhett to explain anything else to me. I have a piece of paper with your own name on it saying you always knew exactly what my husband bought me. I have a probate filing older than your friendship with me. And I have my own calendars placing you in my house on every single date something I loved went missing, because I never once missed writing down a visit from a friend. Rosalyn's composure cracked for the first time, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes that no amount of practiced warmth could smooth back over. You are choosing to believe a mover over 10 years of friendship, she said, and for the first time her voice lost its gentleness entirely. Do you have any idea how many people I have genuinely helped? How many estates I have handled honestly for families who had no one else to trust? You are going to let one situation erase a decade of good work. I am not erasing anything, Constance said. You are the one who erased it, one donation at a time, for 6 years, while I trusted every word you told me. Constance, please, let us talk about this privately, without an audience. You have had 10 years of privacy, Constance said. I would like a witness now. Rosalyn did not answer that either. She closed her clipboard, said something about needing to speak with an attorney, and left the way people leave rooms they know they have already lost, quickly. Without meeting anyone's eyes, her heels sharp against the hardwood all the way to the front door. Justice arrived the quiet way it usually does in a place this size, more paperwork than punishment. The county filed formal fraud charges related to the undisclosed private sales and to the falsified pattern representations, and the county clerk's office froze Harrow Lane Consignment's business license while the case moved forward. The state's separate licensing board opened a wider review, pulling every appraisal Rosalyn had filed across 8 years of business, well beyond the single collection that had started it. A civil settlement, negotiated over the following weeks, returned to Constance the difference between what she had been paid for each donated piece, which was nothing, and what those pieces had actually sold for. Rosalyn never spent a night in a cell. What she lost instead was a decade of standing in a community that noticed, within a single season, exactly why her calendar had gone quiet. Yolanda's private collector, once shown the paperwork, agreed to return the cup he had purchased in good faith, accepting a partial refund rather than fighting a widow's name through the courts. The sugar bowl was traced through 2 more owners before the trail went cold, sold and resold too many times to follow any further. Constance mentioned it only once, quietly, running a finger along the empty space where it used to sit, and never brought it up again after that. The sugar bowl was the one my own question had cost her, the piece that vanished because I had walked into that shop and shown my hand 2 days too soon. I never told her that arithmetic. I suspect she worked it out herself and simply chose to spare me. Dara called me once more, weeks after the settlement, to tell me the county had subpoenaed the private client book Yolanda had described, and that 2 more names had surfaced inside it, 2 more elderly clients with donation patterns that matched Constance's almost exactly. "You should know that," Dara said. "Whatever this cost you, it did not stop with 1 teapot." I did not feel triumphant hearing it. I felt tired instead. The particular tiredness of learning a wound you thought was singular actually had a pattern of its own. Constance asked me a few weeks later to help her arrange what remained of the collection in her new, smaller cottage, a single glass cabinet instead of 2, with room enough for exactly what she had left. The teapot, 2 cups. The photograph, from the hallway, finally reframed and hung above the cabinet instead of tucked behind a door. "Edmund used to say a good tea set outlives everyone who ever drank from it," she told me, setting the teapot in its place with both hands. "The way you settle something you were afraid to lose again." I think he meant it as a joke. I do not think it is a joke anymore. I brought Callan with me the day I delivered the reframed photograph, and he sat at Constance's table, narrating his own tea drinking in a voice grave enough to make her laugh out loud for the first time since the whole ordeal began. "Callan considers the tea a success. Callan would like more shortbread. You never did take it, you know," Constance said to me later, walking me to the door. "That day, at the beginning, she told you to name the pattern and take it. You named it. You never took it. It was never mine to take. It is now if you want it. Not the teapot. I could not part with that. But there is a second, smaller set upstairs I forgot I even owned until all of this started. Plain white with the same rose worked into the handle. Nothing valuable. Nothing anyone would ever fight you over. I would like Callan to have something from this house that was never worth stealing, and never had to be." I did not correct her. I have come to believe she is right. That night, I took Percy's own cup down from my closet shelf for the first time since his funeral, and set it on Callan's shelf beside Constance's gift, the old gold lacquer catching the lamplight the way it always used to catch the light in Percy's shop. Callan asked why one cup looked broken and the other one didn't. I told him it was not broken. It was mended, and mended was a different thing entirely, and someday when he was older, I would explain exactly how different. Callan keeps both cups on a shelf in his room now, and he still narrates himself every time he takes one down to show a friend, careful and solemn, the way his mother used to be with him. Callan holds Percy's cup up to the light first. Callan checks for the mend, because his father taught him that a mend is not a flaw, it is proof. A pattern can be copied. A mend cannot. I told him that the same way Percy told me, drying my hands after washing his cups, and Callan repeated it back once, quietly. The way a boy repeats the one rule he has decided is actually true. Some things stay real no matter how many years pass, or how many people try to convince you they never mattered at all.